Okay, so
Okay,
that
so
should
that
be
should be
started now.
started now.
So I'll
So
just
I'll just
introduce
introduce
Linda
Linda
and you
and
can
you
take
can take
over.
over.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for being willing to listen to my presentation about the research I've been doing. I'm looking forward to hearing your views after this presentation. Just to give you a bit of background, in the beginning, I met some colleagues who worked in Klagenfurt in Austria, and we shared a common interest in adult literacies and decided it would be quite interesting to do a comparative project. We ended up looking at 3 different countries because one of the colleagues lived in or came from South Tyrol in Italy, a German-speaking area, and she'd been conducting research there. So we ended up being able to do a comparative piece of research between 3 different countries. So what I'm going to concentrate on here is the interviews that I conducted with Scottish practitioners as part of that overall project. 4 themes emerged from the interviews. The first one was the reduction in funding for Cbal. I don't think that will come as any surprise to anybody here. As you know, it's been an ongoing issue that we all know about. But as I'll go on to tell you later on, it had major implications for the other issues, particularly because staff were diverted into applying for additional funding to make up for some of these shortfalls. The other issue, obviously related to the first one, was about the difficulties that people had in having the value of Cbal and its approach to learning recognised. Other sectors, especially libraries, schools, health and community care, had to have the value of our approach explained to them. And again, I'll say a little bit more at the end. But the 2 themes I want to talk about most are, first of all, the impact of COVID-19 on provision, and secondly, the important role of Cbal in promoting health and well-being. So I'll now move on to the impact of COVID-19. What I'm doing here is giving you quotes from the practitioners so that you can get the full flavour of the very interesting and useful information that they provided me with. And I'm sure that you all will have experienced these same issues yourselves. It was very difficult at the beginning, of course, for people to get online. Lots of staff didn't have computers at home. There were lots of problems for students, of course, and learners who were certainly not very digitally savvy, and many didn't have anything apart from their mobile phones. As this particular interviewee pointed out, that there was a real problem because people were used to Facebook and WhatsApp. They were easy to use, people were familiar with them, but the local authorities and the NGOs wouldn't allow people to use that. They had to use Teams, and Teams was difficult to access for many people, partly to do with the way that the platform operates, and also because it was very data heavy, and most learners had very limited data allowances, so they simply could not afford to do that if they had to choose between that and contacting their families. I have to say that the practitioners did amazing things to keep in touch with their learners. Lots of people ended up supporting learners on a one-to-one basis. They just were concerned that it was difficult enough for learners to come forward and to work on these platforms. And so if you didn't get them into a group, as this person says, they lose confidence. And you need to kind of give them warm-up support. So also in the next slide, as one pointed out, it's partly about confidence, but also you needed the right equipment and the ongoing support. Of course, all of these were in short supply at the beginning. It did get better, but some people still reported, this is back in June, that they were still hampered by poor equipment and other issues to do with the platforms. Interestingly, people pointed out that the ESOL learners were more digitally savvy because they had to, they were used to keeping in touch with their friends and relatives mostly through their mobile phones, but there was a problem about suitable equipment. The other issue, of course, was with beginning learners. Contacting them by phone was difficult because there was a big barrier in terms of language. You were losing all the gestures and so on that help people to understand. So that was another issue. And of course, there were lots of positives about digital learning. But people were concerned that because it was obviously cheaper in that if you were actually working with people as far as the paymasters were concerned, it was a worry that might be the main way in which they might go forward after the pandemic. And I'll come back to say a bit more about that. One other point I meant to make was that online learning was fantastic for staff in all kinds of ways. It enabled them to participate in meetings, in training and networking much more easily. And just to spare your blushes, Laura, there was a lot of support for the work that Education Scotland did in keeping people together and informing them and so on. So that's the main impacts of COVID-19. Very difficult and some ongoing issues. But now I want to move on to a more interesting area and much more really good finding I felt was that we know that there's been a huge increase in mental health issues that have been exacerbated by the loneliness and isolation that people have experienced. And I was interested, these issues came up quite a lot, and I was trying to find a way of analysing these issues. And I found, or I was helped to find rather, by a couple of practitioners, this from the New Economics Foundation, who identified these 5 aspects of health and well-being: connecting with others, being active, being curious, keeping on learning, and giving to others. So what I'm going to do now is go through all 5 just to illustrate how your work with learners had an impact. So connecting with others was a really important role. This practitioner pointed out, people just weren't seeing anybody. And even though joining these online groups were difficult, learners made it a real priority. And the mental health issues, one practitioner described it as a tsunami. But again, it gave people a connection, especially when people were living on their own. and there weren't a lot of other places open to them. As we know, community centres, libraries were closed, and the kind of spaces that people could easily walk into in the past were closed. So the online classes provided a very useful way of connecting with others. The next area about being active, overall, being active helps people to feel more positive. And there were very imaginative ways in which colleagues tried to help learners to be more active. So there were small walking groups. I think all the local authorities had these kinds of provision right across the board. And again, what I said about ESOL learners earlier, walking along, being able to talk one-to-one or in little groups was a very good way of both being active and having all those other clues to help people with their English. And in one local authority, there was this, which really illustrated how helpful it was when people could coordinate the services across. So you've got outdoor education colleagues training tutors as pastoral walkers. I love that. And it meant that they could connect with learners in safe outdoor spaces. So being active was good for people's mental health and good for their learning simultaneously. So the next aspect is about being curious. It's about helping people to reflect on their experiences and to look forward to what might be in the future, instead of as a way of helping people to get out of that backward-looking way of feeling that things were really getting worse. And there were several main ways. Clearly, we work with people based on their lives experience, interests, and conditions. And when you have groups of people together thinking about their own lives and experience, then that helps them to reflect on their own experiences, see them in a slightly different light, and helping them to be more curious about themselves and other people. And the other aspect is about being critically reflexive. And that was one of the most important issues raised by several people, was about the misinformation that was going on in relation to vaccines. So helping people to think about what would be more accurate information, and just being critically reflective. It's not about telling people that, this is it. It is about helping people to see that you've got to look at what you're presented with in a reflexive way. You've got to be curious about it in this sense. And then finally, people were pointing out that, finally on that last slide, people needed to think about what was their role. And I thought this quote was really helpful, that we should see ourselves, I keep on talking about myself as if I was still a practitioner. You should be thinking about the role as an agent of change, and that the existing situation should always be something that we're able to help people to think about and, if necessary, challenge, rather than just supporting the status quo. Okay, so next area is about keeping on learning. Now, obviously, all our work is about learning. That's what we do. But the pandemic required some adjustments, which again I had not thought about. But one person talked about the the stress that people were subject to. There was the stress resulting from loneliness and isolation, the stress of not being able to contact relatives and friends easily. And so people needed to think about, could they had to adjust the sort of stress that they put people under in relation to their learning, and perhaps reduce the degree of challenge to take into account that sort of circumstances. And people were very concerned about the whole of learners' lives. People seemed to be very vulnerable, and they needed a space that they could learn in. And in many cases, practitioners felt that they needed to help people in terms of getting financial support, that kind of thing that was going to help people to keep on learning. And some people were adjusting programs so that they were, for example, concentrating on things like cooking, so that it was learning, but it was helping people to carry on with that. Okay. The final area, I think, yes, is about giving to others. Now, I think this was the one area where it was the COVID circumstances made it really more difficult for people to engage in that. Again, before the pandemic, there was a lot of camaraderie in the face-to-face groups, which made it easier for people to look outwards. But that became a bit harder to achieve. And again, another example was pre-pandemic, many learners ended up as volunteers. One person that was working in a job club said that his role was really about increasing social integration as part of a holistic program. So there were issues here that made that one of those, the giving to others area, somewhat more difficult to achieve. But nevertheless, it is an integral part of the way practitioners work in learning, and therefore I think another area in which people were able to make a real difference to people's mental health. Now, in that particular analysis, the reducing of loneliness and isolation isn't specifically mentioned, but that has been a key issue, I think, again, where people have been able to make an impact, as I illustrate on the next slide. So I only interview practitioners, so I am reporting what tutors said, that learners said, if you see what I mean. But I have no reason to doubt that these were the actual words of learners. And I'm sure, again, that many of you have had these same experiences, helping people to survive, something to get up for. I think a lot of people spent a lot of time in their pajamas, or possibly in bed. And, I just think that's such an important statement, isn't it? Something to get up for. When we've all been down low, then getting up is quite an achievement at times. And another practitioner talked about the way that learners inspired her, and her view that if they didn't come to the group, they would flounder. So being part of a cooperative group also reduced isolation and loneliness, because that was all about people's strengths. We've always worked that way. but too often people themselves, learners themselves, kind of internalize their deficits and only talk about those. So altogether, all these three areas reduce loneliness and isolation. And there's a great deal of research that shows that these are important across the board, and they also, these kinds of ways of working also help build up people's self-esteem. So now I just want to move on to my conclusions. So as I said at the beginning, clearly the background of underfunding over many years made a difference as to what was possible. So they exacerbated these problems in online learning, and part-time tutoring staff were particularly badly affected. It was partly to do with sort of local authority procedures where they didn't seem to count as staff in the normal sense, that staff that would get equipment as a matter of course. And as we know, a lot of tutoring is carried out by part-time tutors, and I just think that this is a clear difficulty in the work that we've been doing. And then there's the other issue, as I mentioned at the beginning, about having to apply for external funding and to justify Cbal's contributions, especially to schools and health and social care. However, it wasn't all, things did change, as the next slide shows. So, although it took time, in many local authorities, people worked together with a range of other professions. And once people had experienced that kind of partnership working, then they did recognize really clearly what Cbal could do. And that will remain, I firmly believe, as did the practitioners I interviewed, that investment, as it were, in building partnerships made a real difference. And I think it will pay off in the future. And of course, the professional culture of practitioners also made a big difference to how people were engaged. It meant that this was being responsive to learners, using their experience, respecting the knowledge that they brought. All these things contributed to a really important way of working that was recognized and helped learners to carry on despite all the other issues that they were experiencing. So, as a final conclusion, it's clear, and the Scottish Government has published a really nice paper, which we can provide the link for, that the inequalities in education that are accessible to the most and least advantaged are increasing. And what my piece of research showed is that if you're on low income, that combines with educational and digital inequalities to exacerbate already existing disadvantage. And the Scottish Government is absolutely committed to achieving a fairer Scotland, and there are many provisions in place to help us do that. But it seems to me that the important role of Cbal in potentially addressing these inequalities is not yet really widely recognised. And certainly there is not sufficient funding to provide the sort of quality of teaching and learning that we should be. We could be engaging with far more learners. We could be addressing many of the issues that the Scottish Government is prioritising, but somehow, as yet, that message does not yet seem to have got through. So I have sent this little piece of research far and wide in the hope that it might make a small contribution to that. But I think really we all have to try to find ways of making sure that the excellent work that is going on in Cbal gets more widely recognised, and that recognition includes more funding. So thank you very much for listening to me.